Here are your goals. By the end of the video, you should be able to explain what the first and second Reconstruction Acts accomplished, what the initial effects of radical Reconstruction were on Black political participation, who the carpetbaggers were. You should be able to discuss the pros and cons of radical governments in the South. You should be able to describe the violent tactics used by Southerners to resist change, and you should be able to discuss the effect of these tactics. So Congressional Reconstruction took place in two big chunks. The first chunk happened with the first Reconstruction Act. And what this did is it sent the Northern Army down to rule the Southern states until the Southern states were readmitted into the Union. Also, it forced the Southern states to ratify the 14th Amendment. Until they ratified the 14th Amendment, soldiers were going to stay in the South and basically rule them as conquered territory. Also, it forced the South to change their state constitutions in order to allow Black men to vote. The second Reconstruction Act happens a little bit later, and it happens because even though states changed their constitution to allow Black men to vote, they intimidate Black men at the polls and scare them away. So even though Black men now have the right to vote, they are scared away by Southern people with guns, as you see in that picture there. And so the Second Reconstruction Act takes the important step of putting Northern troops in charge of voting. And so Northern soldiers protect African Americans while they come in to vote, and this allows them to gain a political voice. The Reconstruction Act also prevents voting by former Confederate leaders. So all the people who were in charge of the South before are kicked out, which creates space for new leadership. And finally, Congressional Reconstruction also passes the 15th Amendment, which eliminates race as a factor in determining voting rights, which makes it so that Black men can vote all across the United States, not just in the South, but everywhere. So one of the big effects of Congressional Reconstruction is Black political participation. For the first time in American history, Black people gain a voice and can begin to elect their own representatives. And one of the main things that happens right away is that the Union League emerges. And the Union League was sort of the center, was the beating heart of African American political activity in the South. It was a network of political clubs where people could get together and talk about politics and organize. And through the Union League, one of their main purposes was to educate Black people in the South about their new civil rights, because these people, a lot of them were not very well educated, many of them couldn't read, and so they needed a little bit extra help learning about what their new freedoms actually were and how they should go about voting, what party they should join, stuff like that. Also, the Union League helped to raise funds for schools and churches, so it took part in building up African American community structures for education and religion and stuff. And finally, and interestingly, in my opinion, they helped to organize militias to protect against racial violence. So a lot of Southerners were unhappy about the Union League, but the Union League started to organize in order to fight back against racist, reactionary Southerners. So all told, about 700,000 African Americans registered to vote during Reconstruction. And what this meant was the election of Black representatives. And so as a result of this, there were lots of Black men elected to office. There were 16 people sent to Washington, D.C. as representatives, 14 to the House of Representatives, and 2 to the Senate. And there were also many, many mayors, state senators, sheriffs, and other local politicians who were able to come to power because of radical Reconstruction's protection of the African American vote. Another important effect was increasing Northern influence in the South. So many people in the North saw Reconstruction as an opportunity to find work, an opportunity to gain employment, or just to make a change in the South. And so lots of people headed to the South, including politicians, teachers, and lawyers. And they head to the South in order to take part in this transformation. And they basically want to help govern the United States or the southern states, or to help reform it. So lawyers and politicians try to get elected to office or get appointed to office so they can work in the government. Northern teachers come down and try to make a change by educating people and changing the way Southerners think, spreading literacy, stuff like that. These Northerners who came down to the South were known as carpetbaggers by the South, carpetbag being a big traveling sack. And these carpetbaggers were hated by pro-Confederate Southerners because they believed that these guys were responsible for many of the South's problems. They blamed all the economic hardship that was going on in the South, not on the terrible war they just fought, but on these interfering Northerners. So as a result of these changes, black political participation and increasing Northern influence, the government in the South changed a lot. The old Confederate leaders were no longer allowed to serve. And so what this meant is that there were going to be totally new people in charge. And there were a lot of important positive accomplishments of these governments. These governments were able to address the concerns of the common people of the South for the first time, because the old people who had been in control were basically rich white plantation owners. And so these governments built schools and roads, and they adjusted the tax code, both of which really helped poor people, both black and white. And so this was a really big accomplishment. On the con side, there was a lot of political corruption. And this happened primarily because a lot of the new political leaders were not very experienced, so they didn't know when they were being taken advantage of by slick business owners or other people. And this led to a lot of waste of government money, and it led to a number of politicians or people who worked for the government enriching themselves, sometimes making themselves small fortunes at the expense of Southern taxpayers. And so this actually led to a lot of anger, especially among pro-Confederate Southerners who already were angry about this new form of government. Finally, one other effect of Congressional Reconstruction was violent reaction. So most Southerners, most white Southerners that is, resented these changes, and they blamed their own hardships and their own difficulties on the freedmen and on carpetbaggers. And in order to try and fix things, the South resorted to violence and terror. And the Southern whites used these methods, these illegal methods, to retain control in the South. Because they had lost legal rights, they could no longer legally exclude black people from politics. They started using illegal methods and methods of terrorism. So one method that was widely used and used for a long time was the method of lynching. Lynching was a form of mob violence that was unleashed both on black people in the South and also on white people. So the black people who were lynched were usually those who tried to make use of their new political rights to vote or to, maybe to buy land or basically to do anything to better their condition. White people who were targeted by lynching were those who associated with African Americans, or also could just be Northerners who came down to help change the South. And what lynching usually involved was some sort of public torture, beating, mutilation, and then ended with a hanging. And the noose became a symbol for lynching and for racial violence because of this. The Ku Klux Klan was another outgrowth of violence resulting from Congressional Reconstruction. And so the Ku Klux Klan was organized to use violence to intimidate Southern reformers. So basically to target the same groups targeted by lynching. And the KKK sought out and secretly killed or tortured people who stood for change in the South. And this group existed until the late 1870s. And when the 1870s rolled around, racist white Southerners had basically regained control of the South. And then the KKK disbanded. But it was reformed later on and still exists today. So in response to these violent outbursts, the federal government attempts to combat this violence with the Force Acts, which they pass in 1870 and 1871, but only with limited success. It's impossible to stomp out all of the violence. You can't be everywhere all the time. And so, in spite of the federal government's intervention, this violent reaction by white Southerners achieves its goal of reducing black political participation, and pretty soon the South goes back to basically being ruled exclusively by white men. So here are your video goals again, and we're going to talk about this stuff tomorrow in class. Thanks for listening.